I began this book in the darkest years of a dictatorship that tyrannized 200 million people. I began writing it in a prison designated as a political isolation ward. I wrote it in secret. I hid the manuscript and the forces of good, human and otherwise, concealed it for me during searches. But if sometime in the future it reaches only a few persons whose spiritual thirst drives them to surmount all its difficulties and read it through to the end, then the ideas planted within cannot help but become seeds that will sprout in their hearts.
The more I met Russian people here on the boulevard, where the company of my uncle Jean-Michel had a retail point of roasted chestnuts for sale, the more I realized that I'd chosen the right subject for my diploma, and I should try to understand this country. I still could not pinpoint exactly what I felt so special in it and its people, but they definitely had something special in them. At that time, I dimly suspected that the man whose book was so interesting for me, the philosopher and mystic Daniel Andreev, just may not have been born in some other country, among other people.
Can
I move for 10 minutes? Yes, you can. Andreev and his mysticism occupied my attention completely. There was no escaping for me, and it was already my personal mysticism, for I was born in France and scarcely visited other countries. But I dimly felt that right here there is the key to so many secrets connected with the history of mankind, including my native France. Fortunately, my expectations were justified. Precisely in Russia, I have found the necessary information resources. It turned out that documentaries about the book Rose of the World had been filmed here, and even a play was out somewhere in the province. It was amazing.
The first event that played an enormous, even decisive role in the development of the inner world of Daniel Andreev occurred in August 1921, when he was only 15 years old. It happened in Moscow at the end of the day as he was wandering aimlessly near the Christ the Saviour Cathedral. The raging, dazzling, incomprehensible world covering the Russian historical reality suddenly opened in front of him, being in unity with something greater. The Great Spirit that had once passed away on our earth in the guise of Saint Seraphim of Sarov approached him, leaned toward him, covered him with an orarion, a tent with streaming rays of light and tender warmth. Later, over the years, Daniel Andreev was internally fed with the images and ideas gradually flowing from there to his consciousness. Further, similar conditions occurred at different times, but each time his experience was completely new. In early 1943, Daniel Andreev participated in the passage of the 196th Rifle Division on the ice of Lake Ladoga, and after the two-day crossing of the Karelian Isthmus, he arrived in besieged Leningrad late at night. The confrontation of the irreconcilable inceptions, monstrous in their scope and intensity, suddenly thickened and glittered in front of him. Much later, he described in his books the demonic creature that was connected to this experience with the expression, the third Uicraore. Its size and shape inspired a thrill of horror in him, an old campaigner, and only the breezy sparkle of the approaching spirit, the leader of the people of our motherland, the Russian demiurge Yarosvet, spared his mind from irreparable fracture. But the most significant experience, enormous in its scope, was gained by Daniel Andreev during his stay in prison, more precisely, in a political prison. Long rows of prison nights became a continuous contemplation and reflection for him. The unseen and sometimes visible guides led him into the spaces of other worlds. He could see worlds of the rising number, where hosts of angels, demons, and great souls who did good things on earth continued to create things to the glory of God for the sake of enlightenment of the earthly humanity and upgrading of the entire planetary cosmos. He went down to the lower layers, up to those that were adjacent to the strata of the Earth's magma, and saw the infinite suffering and redemptive work of those who had been in service of the evil forces on Earth, who arrogantly had not believed in the existence of higher forces, who stank with earthly blessings, haughtily separating themselves from other people. Their sufferings were surely terrible, and their current situation caused compassion in him. However, the laws of the cosmos are inexorable. The dramatic panoramas of Shadana-Kar, or planetary cosmos, opened to Daniel Andreev, bewitching and overwhelming him with their blatant reality, logical arrangement, and severity of ethical harmonization. He did not have any doubt that the things he observed were as real as the familiar reality of our earthly world. I had the great good fortune to talk with those who've long left us, and now are in the cinclet of heavenly Russia. closeness of the great brothers caused rapid beating of my heart and some solemn awe. Could I hear their voices? Yes, I could, but not physically. They penetrated into me from somewhere in the depths, from inside, as if it was out of my heart. Sometimes those meetings took place during the day in a crowded prison cell, and when I lay down on the bunk, I turned away to the wall to hide my tears, crying out of excited happiness. It was this revelation that allowed Daniel Andreev to see that there are other processes, transcendent, invisible, behind real history, involving a huge number of intelligent beings from other worlds. But as these worlds or layers of Shadanakar are inhabited by both light and dark demonic forces, there is a continuous struggle for our earthly world that is called Enroth. And this struggle for our world is the history of our world, but a different, invisible history. It is called metahistory. The creation, or rather the restoration of the Russian people after the tragic centuries of stagnation, was predetermined by the demiurge Yarosvet and the collective Russian soul Navna. Forests and grasslands of the future European Russia seem to be quite capacious for resettlement of huge crowds of people in the future, and the East opened another spatial, inexhaustible reserve extending to the Pacific Ocean. It was not a country, but a whole part of the world, and the breath, not only the human breath, could be taken away by the anticipation of events measured by its scale. But the activation of the forces of light always cause activation of the anti-theistic forces in global metahistory. In the 13th century, the supreme ruler of the powers of darkness, Gagtunga, sent his demonic giant monster, the militant Uicraore of the Mongol tribes, against the young, immature Yarosvet. It was the first mighty blow against Russia administered by Gagtunga. It was the meta-historical event that was behind the great catastrophe of our history, the invasion of the Mongols and Tatars. The Russian egregor was crushed to pieces and half torn apart by the blows of the Mongolian monster. The movement towards the national unity was interrupted. The people's body was dissected into many pieces that were barely kept alive and hardly retained their ability for future reunification. And then, the demiurge of the Russian super-people was faced with a choice. Either it abandons its mission on the earth, that is, to create earthly Russia and heavenly Russia, or he consents to the appearance of a demonic Shrastra, a lair inhabited by demonic creatures in the lower worlds, adjacent to the earthly Russia. In this case, a powerful and sovereign demon would have been admitted to administering the state, the demon of state power, in other words, Uicraore. The demiurge realized that the enemy of their own camp should be opposed to the hostile tools of the dark forces, and then he made his choice. the demonic forces have created a Russian Shastra, and the first Viceroy of Russia began to reign in order to rule the country together with the Demiurge. The situation was even more dramatized by the fact that the Demiurge had to make one more sacrifice, disastrous in its significance. Under this terrible treaty, Navna, the collective soul of the Russian people, destined to encourage them as the main muse for the creators of the Russian metaculture, was imprisoned in an unassailable fortress in Direcor, one of the topmost layers of the demonic world. The further course of Russian history, quirky and controversial, was predetermined by this action.
In Paris, the advisor of my diploma, Monsieur Vijour, warned me that it would be difficult to write a work about Andreev. Russian mysticism was incredibly multi-layered and its roots lay in some kind of prehistoric times. I needed a Russian expert who could help me to understand the massifs of strange information got by Daniel Andreev. After a long search, I finally found a professor of philosophy who'd written several scientific works about Daniel Andreev.
Russian samovar. There's a cone. A cone. The water's there.
Hey, don't do it!
So, tell me please, what do you do in France? Do you study or not? Study? Yes, yes. Where exactly? In the Sorbonne? Oui. What course of study? What course? Third? Second? Third. Would you like some tea? Yes, please. Maybe stronger. Oh, thank you. Tell me, please, what are you working on now? What issues? Well, now I understand what the main paradox of Russian history is. Oh, really? To save people from the Mongols, the Demiurge of Russia made a contract with demons. Well, yes, this is the starting point of metahistory, the metahistory of Russia. But I want to note the term demons is very simple, very common. I would have called them, well, like Andreev, Viceroys. Exactly, the Viceroys. In the Indian epics there are Asuras, and Andreev has the Viceroys. So I think that Andreev and the Indian wise men, Shramanas, saw the same creatures. Powerful, potent creatures of the demonic world who just dispose the destinies of entire nations. Do you understand? Yeah, maybe you're right. But actually, it does not change the essence. More tea? Thank you. According to Andreev, it turns out that there's always been tyranny in Russia. The Viceroys demanded that rulers keep people in slavery to invade the territories. Yes, yes. The Viceroy becomes stronger if the territory under his control is larger, the population is bigger. This is the starting point of metahistory. So, throughout its history, Russia, somehow, the influence of demons, the Viceroys in the world, this conclusion follows logically, is it right? has increased the influence. It seems to me that the power of the Vitzrayors is a constant value. It can neither be increased nor enhanced. And it depends on us whether we control where this power will break, where it will come up, you know. The Russian people have suffered a lot of blood was shed. We've always tried to suffocate, to soothe this power, you know. The people are inwardly directed toward the light, the goodness, the truth. Was there ever another kind of people in the world who, being under such pressure of tyranny, so humbly accepted the despotism of their own government? These people seem to understand that the oppressor would just die without their power being reciprocated. And the most surprising thing of all is that it is in the most difficult moments of their history that this power actually saved the people. Saved them not only from the destruction by other peoples, but also by the folly of their own selves. Well, there are not any people in the world who would not succumb to the influence of these dark forces. You think that your France is so light and clean? Well, no. Let us assume, for example, the French Revolution. Do you agree? Yes. And how much blood was shed? How many heads were chopped off? And what about the night of St. Bartholomew? The Crusades, after all. Nothing but blood. Everything was covered with blood. These were just the incidents. I think France did not take the evil into the world. I think that it has a strong demiurge, bright spirit. It is stronger than its demon, and I think this is the norm for Europe. There is no need in it. That is the so-called Holy Inquisition. Andreev says that Lucifer completely subjugated the Christian Church. And I think that it has not become more sterile. Europe. You say Europe. But it's just creeping into his paws, into his tentacles. Tolerance, human rights. These are just the masks, guises, covers. But in reality, it encourages the most terrible, awful sins, you see? After all, this is Europe that erases the boundaries, the differences between the genders, between man and woman. By the way, Andreev wrote about it, about this plan of Lucifer, that by this plan he paves the way to absolute power, the power over the whole world, you know? Soon enough, after the accession of the first demon of statehood, as a result of collecting of the popular forces made by him, began the ousting of the Mongol Vitzrayor and his human tools from the territory of Russia. The light promises of the demiurge, complementing the inspiration of the Vitzrayor, gradually changed the balance of powers in the favor of the Russian people. The demiurge directed princes to unity. The Vitzrayor built the state linchpin. After a number of difficult and bloody battles, the Mongolian Vitzrayor suffered heavy damage. The monolith of his earthly armies was destroyed, and he was forced to withdraw to the east. I can say that meeting with the professor encouraged me. He was an absolutely sane, clearly minded person, and he was confident that everything mentioned in The Rose of the World
is not a figment of the imagination or sick mental states. I plunged into the layers of Russian history and more became convinced that, namely, the logic of Andreev is the most adequate explanation of everything that's happening in the country. Nothing else, except the activities of some invisible powerful monsters, could explain the paradoxes of Russian history.
After crushing the enemy, the first Uicraore of Russia, who had swallowed up huge portions of Gavak, quickly began to gain strength and expand his influence. He became able to build the statehood and organize the people's life. The Demiurge and the Uicraore led people to expansion of the territory. It was one of those rare in the life of any nation periods when such forces, different in nature, hierarchical levels and aims, combined their efforts in common work. The rapid development of new territories, starting in the east, expanded to North America. The development of the lands by the Russians, their very movement, was completely irrational. It was not dictated by any external material interests. It was just providentially determined, a magnificent process of forming an arena for the future activity of the emerging supra people. Ivan IV was the last of the major human tools of the first Viceroy of Russia. The practice of his reign showed that the tragic duality, spiritual and practical, was of the origin associated with a simultaneous action of the two opposing principles. The conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan by Ivan IV completed the period activity of the first demon of Russian greatness, where the subtle material circuits of Russian statehood had become particularly strong. However, Ivan IV was the shining example of a rodomisy oppressor, a personality who brilliantly embarked on an extensive field of cultural and public activities, but later fell into the abyss of infra-physical layers. It's easy to see how the influence of the demiurge of the supra people and the militant demon of greatness coexisted in Ivan IV, merging and then starting to fight. The terrible posthumous fate of Ivan the Terrible was determined by the fact that some of his character features made him easily accessible for unconscious spiritual substitutions. The history of this rodomissile, if comprehended at the appropriate level, could serve as a lesson to all the further leaders of the people. Alas, it was not destined to happen. The tragic end of Ivan IV's reign became momentum for the beginning of the first Russian Viceroy's gradual weakening. Striving to keep the hesitated state axis, he managed to find human tools, but no one of his henchmen was fully ready to fulfill the mission of retention. The collapse of the state continued. The contours of the upcoming time of troubles were emphasized. The state started to collapse. As a small but aggressive demon of statehood of Poland reached the area under control of the first Viceroy, it came to a disaster. In the bitter and bloody fight, the first Viceroy of Russia was badly wounded, and shortly after, he gave up his spirit. His only child, a purple Zhrugrit who stayed in the citadel, could do nothing to resist the mature Viceroy of Poland. But all of this time, the demiurge of Russia, Yarosvet, worked towards rejuvenating popular forces. Sometime later, the foreign yoke was destroyed at a very early age. And still, the first Viceroy of Russia began to rebuild the forces of statehood.
написал Даниил Андреев, было целым
The things described by Daniel Andreev are the entire cosmos, the universe. It looks like a colossal hologram. When you plunge into it, an obvious question arises. Where is your place here? Who are you yourself? Where are you from? Why and where are you going? I've always dimly known that a human is a very complicated creature, and our soul is virtually immortal and can exist not only in this world. And now those of my dim, my naive guesses have been confirmed, and then some.
Мне был особенно подробно показан один из слоев.
One of the layers of Shadhanakar has been particularly shown me in detail, the one in which human monads reside. Both the immortal and indivisible spirits unite the higher selves of people. This is, in fact, what we are. Those who live their lives in Enroth, in their physical bodies, and then leave them. I've clearly felt that each earthly life is just part of the path of the rising monad, a small fragment of its endless cosmic life. In history, there have always been unique people. They are the conductors of higher powers, the chosen ones, messengers. They're shown in the other worlds, where they can see the structure of the universe. That is, for example, yes, the Divine Comedy. I learned this entire work in Italian.
На итальянском.
Here you are. It's very valuable. So you're engaged into this topic, not by accident. Do you understand? So, in the prison, Daniel was visiting the subtle worlds more and more frequently. And he began to write the book on this basis. And in the end, The Rose of the World was written. I think it was his mission to provide the world with such knowledge, you know. This is a comprehensive image of all the worlds. It's not a philosophical treatise, right? It's a revelation. But after studying this book, you can understand how the world which we live in is arranged and what happens to us after death and so on, you know? It is the extensional, real cosmogony. Cosmogony? Cosmogony. Worldview. I understand. I can feel that there's another reality. Because I was so attracted to these descriptions, Dante, Andreev. There's something irrational in the flow of history. Irrational, exactly. Where are these millstones? Who turns them? It is unclear. It is not visible. And here comes Daniel Andreev, and it seems like he pulls a curtain, and the power is disclosed, you know? Those who are behind the scenes, who pull the strings of the rulers, appear. They are the demons, the Uicraores. But the light powers also immediately appear. Those who oppose the demons, who are trying to limit the influence of these Uicraores, these demons, they are demiurges, the spirits guiding the people. What a power, what a view. Yes, yes. Something urged me to open this book. I just saw it on the counter, there, on the counter on Montmartre. You know, all right, you know, the time will come. People will mature. They will seek to capture this hidden logic of events. And then they will adjust, agree their actions with this logic, and not with the usual real life. Do you understand, Henry? Come on, let's go. The
The birth of the king's son in the royal family could not be accidental. He was the man who, according to his spiritual level, talent, intelligence, and physical temperament, exactly corresponded to the ideal image of a statesman required at the time by Russia, its metaculture, its mission, and its destiny. The birth of individuals of such value is equal to 1 per hundreds of millions of births. From the very beginning, Peter I realized the essence of his mission: to transform Russia into a world power and the Russian people into supra-people. He was keenly aware that his personal task was to turn Russia to the path leading from vegetating in national isolation into the space of universal establishment. This was only possible if Russia perceived the advanced inceptions of a neighboring, more advanced culture. The Rodomysl Peter was able to carry out such a term, making the people's breakthrough to huge knowledge and opened a way for its further development, both material and cultural. However, the demon of greatness worked hard in order to implement its tyrannical trend into the Rodomysl. For this purpose, he was able to redevelop severe hardness that was necessary and inevitable in Peter's position into the implacability, inner freedom from authority, into the ferocious ferocity against all the authorities of the past. The manifestations of cruelty showed a clear, distinguished, sadistic tinge. So, the Rodomysl Peter became the second great figure in Russian history, whose light mission was distorted and coarsened by the Viceroy. The dual nature of the driving forces of Russian history was prominently defined.
Дело в том, что у сил света и тьмы разная природа.
The point is that the forces of light and darkness are of a different nature. The forces of darkness were also created by the Prime Creator as a means of teaching the rising monads through sufferings. However, the interaction between the forces of light and darkness is determined by the law of balance. When there's too much evil, the powers of light are activated and align the balance. This law largely determines the course of world history. It was unlikely that all of the Russian kings and queens following Peter on the historical arena were quite aware of the goal toward which the Russian people were directed by the Demiurge and the Viceroy. But in the end, the actions of each of the Russian rulers had a tremendous meta-historical excuse. Due to them, by the end of the 19th century, the Russian state had acquired its geographical contours that coincided broadly with those boundaries of the supra-people that were outlined during its creation by the Demiurge. The aim of the demon of greatness was to strengthen state power. The aim of the Demiurge was to transform Russia from a marginal Eastern European country into a great Eurasian power, filling all the empty spaces between the Northwest, Roman Catholic, Muslim, Indian, and Far Eastern cultures. These spatial reserves aimed to serve as an arena for creative activities of the supra-people that were witnessed by the 21st, 22nd, and the subsequent centuries. The destruction of the aggressive Viceroy of France, who suddenly gained momentum in the early 19th century, and who had a strong and intelligent human tool, marked the zenith of power and maturity of the second Viceroy. It was the first really important result of his collaboration with the Demiurge of Russia. At that time, they did not have any suitable human tool in Enroth, so they spread their inspiration onto the entire small nation, uniting it and raising for the fight. It was the first appearance of the spirit and a popular leader of Russia, Yarosvet, on the all-planetary arena, as his magnificent shining was clearly seen in all the worlds. After the victory that was achieved through the joint efforts of the Demiurge and Viceroy, something incredible happened. The second Viceroy made concessions regarding the destiny of Navna, the collective soul of the Russian people. For the whole century, until the collapse of the First Empire, she took the opportunity to leave the fortress in Direcor, encouraging people through the emanations of her maternal love and sending the creative inspiration to her creators and thinkers. Owing to that, a way of embodiment in Enroth opened for the whole pleiad of mighty human souls who'd stayed in various layers of heavenly Russia. One by one, they came there to accomplish their glorious missions, to bestow their wisdom and products of their inspired work upon people. Daniel Andreev called this amazing pleiad of Russian artists and thinkers the heralds, and the phenomenon itself, the herald activity. It took only a century for the heartfelt poetry, deep and highly artistic literature, original painting, music, theatre and philosophy to arise in Russia. That's how the principles of the metaculture of the Russian people and its main zatomices were formed. So, no nation is able to comprehend its own essence and purpose without those principles. The amplitude of worldview fluctuations of these people was amazing. For only a decade, 3 new religions were imposed on them, and they accepted them obediently, every time harnessed of their hard historical cart. That's why Daniel Andreev's idea of the national consciousness duality appearing a long time ago seemed fair to me. Andreev thought that Christianity failed to completely replace the more ancient and more complete ideological system that was to a large extent lost by the people after global catastrophes, but continued to live in the depths of the national consciousness. There's no doubt that the act of Christianization of the Kievan Rus was a providential act that took place in accordance with the will of the demiurge. At first, the Christian myth poured into the consciousness of the people in a powerful way, attracting the hearts of many people with the images of the Almighty, the Most Holy Mother of God, and the saints, the holy things of Jerusalem and Mount Athos. The merchants of Tsargrad sent white rays, warming the soul and engaging them into a religious creativity. However, the adoption of Christianity did not lead to the strict stay of the people's soul within one religious track. In the layer of images saturating the consciousness of people, his observant eyes easily detected the huge unit of such images that were not related to any ideology or the pantheon of Christianity. This ancient Slavic worldview that was called Great Russianity by Daniel Andreev was shaded after the advent of Christianity and moved onto the back burner. But in their depth, great forests securely stored the relationship of human being and the elementals, enchantments of the magicians, games in the glory of the creative powers, spells of the witches, the rituals, linking humans with the invisible inhabitants and owners of nature. It was an echo of the great civilization that once passed away and provided the world with a great experience. The civilization whose development was interrupted, apparently by sudden, fatal, cosmic events. Professor, I remembered a dream. A dream? I was a child, about 10 years old. And what happened in that dream? A bonfire, a huge bonfire. Magnifique. The idols. Wooden statues. Yes, wooden statues. And a man dressed in white put a flower wreath on my head. A wreath of flowers.
Yeah, and a fire. There was a big fire.
And then all the people dressed in white held hands and walked around the fire, right?
Yes, it was exactly like that, and I joined them.
You know, I assumed that the man in a white shirt was me. That's why when I met you, you seemed very familiar. It's been a long time ago, but you've already been here, many centuries ago.
What was this country?
Tartaria.
Tartaria?
Yes, Great Tartaria, the country of Assas, of the Slavic Aryans, our homeland. Homeland of our ancestors. Just look through the encyclopedias, maps. There's a lot written about it. You've been here already. That is why you were attracted to it.
Do you think so? It's strange. Very strange.
Now I see why you began to study Daniel Andreev, when you still did not understand Russian very well. During the travels of Daniel Andreev into the regions of Shadhanakar, he could see the inhabitants of the infra-physical worlds preparing a major war by making leaders of the earthly humanity unleash it. By the beginning of the 20th century, several large demons of statehood reached their maturity and fiercely tried to increase their influence, to absorb the neighboring regions at the level of Enroth and in the layers of other worlds. The roar of these beasts, incited by their master, Gagtungar, was echoed in the louder and more powerful way across the layers of Shadhanakar, causing consternation among some beings and sweet fury relating to the great prophet in others. The Viceroy's mind was quite capable of reaching the prospects that were promised due to the development of people's military industry. So, they anticipated the possibility of receiving unprecedentedly large portions of gavak by killing hundreds of thousands and even millions of people. Russia was not protected by any oceans or mountain ranges from the strong powers that had emerged in the West. Their demiurges, as well as the aggressive statehood demons, were waiting for the weakening of the rapidly weakening old Viceroy of Russia in order to drop on him, destroy the dilapidated statehood of Russia by the hordes of their human tools. The initiator of the World War was the Viceroy of Germany, distraught due to the swiftness of his own growth, greed and envy. His plan was to unleash the World War as an unprecedentedly large source of the nutrient gavak. Unfortunately, the human tool of the weakened Viceroy of Russia was a nervous, weak-willed man who had a note of fatalism and resignation in his soul. In his presence, the country slowly began to sink into chaos and anarchy. The process of moral corruption in the highest levels became greater. His powerful assistant, represented by the Prime Minister and sent by the providential will to help him, was not appreciated and protected by him with due diligence. The war quickly expanded into a bloodbath, grinding in the mincing machine hundreds of thousands of people. Mont Blancs of gavak flowed into the lower Shastras, causing an insane gluttony of their inhabitants and the thirst for new portions.
Some events of the war, for example, the Battle of Verdun, cannot be explained by any other logic except the metaphysical logic. Throughout the entire year, the German and French armies stood facing each other within a small space, and 700,000 people were lost in this mousetrap. Through the prism of Daniel Andreev's metaphysics, the first great war of the new time appeared before me as a fierce battle of huge demonic monsters. I suddenly realized that the scale of this nightmare was not only connected with the improvement of murder weapons, but also with the growth of world population. It turns out that the more people we have, the more of them may be killed, and there's more food for the Uicraores and hordes of small demons. It turns out that humans are their harvest, their breeding ground, where they were grown to kill them. They bred us in the way we breed rabbits or hens to eat their meat afterwards. But the demons ate no meat, but gavak, energy emission released through the killing of people. We ourselves went for slaughter, a stupid, mindless cattle that only looked like a smart one. We ourselves created a murder weapon against us, so it would be more convenient for demons to kill us.
Meanwhile, in the middle of the 19th century, Western Europe witnessed the formation of universal studies that, for the next 100 years, dominated 1/3 of the globe. The mouthpieces for the militant and rational mindset, inherited from the encyclopedists and strengthened by the successes of natural sciences, brought the provisions of materialism into the dogma. Positive ideals of this doctrine, caught by the rollers of an energetic but narrow and limited mind, covered with pride, became flattened and compressed, and might lose their spirituality. The proclaimed methods were in sharp contrast with the requirements of the elementary humanity. The guides of these studies were active and consistent in the development of their influence on the ignorant layers of the proletariats and artisans. When the young and strong Uicraore of Germany completed his activity and squeezed in an iron embrace the body of the third Uicraore of Russia with his emanations, brown and pale Zhirogrits rushed to rescue the father instead of killing him, according to the terrible custom of the demons. They understood that the question is existence of the very citadel of the Uicraores of Russia. But the purple Zhirogrit was quicker than others. Seizing the moment of agony of his father, he was able to sink his teeth into his body and devour his heart to commit an act after which the eater becomes the successor of the deceased. The late autumn raged in Enroth. Icy rains were beating streets and palaces of St. Petersburg as the cruiser cannons fired at the walls of the Winter Palace on the Neva River. And in the deep underworld, the purple winner placed a golden cube on his head. He became the third Uicraore of Russia. The first leader of the Second Empire was neither bloodthirsty nor actively cruel. He stubbornly believed in a doctrine and worked not for his own sake, but for the sake of his ideal. The bloodshed or causing of sufferings did not give him any pleasure. His character demonstrated even those properties that seemed obstructive in terms of his mission. But that could not be drowned completely. He loved humanity in his own way, with an abstract, dreamy love. And if sometimes he used rather harsh measures, it was not dictated by revenge or inhumanity, but by the confidence that it was the revolutionary necessity.
Однако в своей посмертной судьбе человека дух, именовавшийся
But
здесь в
in
Европе,
his afterlife, the human spirit,
совершил нечто поразительное,
named Lenin,
обрушившись
has
в
done
соответствии с
something
своей кармой
amazing.
в один из миров
In accordance with the load of his karma,
он впоследствии
he descended
получил возможность стать
upon one of the worlds of retribution and got an opportunity to become the leader unifier of the whole group of demonic Shrastras. And thus to become one of the most powerful hierarchs in the demonic world.
демонического мира. Но он
He
нашел
found the
силы
strength to
отказаться
abandon
от
that role because he understood how it could threaten earthly mankind. And due to that,
за что и был низвергнут.
he was cast down to the very bottom of Shaddanakar.
Однако
later,
впоследствии он был поднят оттуда.
He was raised from there by the forces of the Russian Synclet and the Demiurge. Thus, thanks to his feat, the human spirit got on the path of complete transformation.
Постепенно я уловил в метаистории России устойчивые закономерности.
Gradually, I managed to catch stable patterns of Russian metahistory. At the Sorbonne, I'd learned mathematical modeling, and it was easy for me to present Russian history in the form of charts. They showed a history of rising, strengthening, and breakdown of three Vitzrayors, three great demons of Russian statehood. Suddenly, huge historical time periods clearly came into my view. The chains of great events lined up in a logical sequence. I understood that I was formalizing the history, and it would help me to understand the essence of those events that were happening at that time when I lived my own life, when I could directly observe history unfolding.
Появление этого существа
According to Daniel Andreev,
было
the appearance of
предопределено
such a
очень
creature
давно.
was predestined a long time ago and prepared by the most powerful forces of infraspace. In the Russian literature, an astounding prediction about it was made in the 19th
Сделанное в
century.
19 веке. Это мужчина среднего роста,
This is a man of medium
с каким-то
height
деревянным
with a
лицом.
kind of wooden face.
Как смоль черные волосы
The
покрывают
jet black
конический
hair
череп
covers his tower skull
и плотно, как
and
его
frames
голка,
his narrow forehead
обрамляет узкий
tightly
лоб.
as a skull cap. His eyes
Глаза, осененные
are shaded by
припухшими
somewhat
веками.
swollen eyelids.
Взгляд чистый, без
His glance is clean, without
губы тонкие,
hesitation.
бледные, опушенные
His lips are thin,
щетиной
pale,
усов.
fringed with a trimmed bristle.
Военного
He's
покроя
wearing a
шелка,
buttoned-up, military cut
застегнутый на все
frock
пуговицы.
coat. After retiring from the historical stage of the first leader of the Second Empire, Joseph Dugashvili, changing his name into Stalin, was able to convert the third Vitzrayor's inspiration to himself. Feeling the threads of support from the infernal world, the second leader managed to bring all his competitors to the execution or ostracism with his masterfully conducted intrigues. He did not fail to crush all the opposition groups within the party and outside of it, one by one, like insect nests. He found ways to beat the intelligentsia to powder because it was a fermenting ground for disagreement. By capturing the Kremlin and strengthening as a dictator of the vast nation that was alien to him by blood and its spirit, he began to use this tremendous resource coldly and calculatedly to construct a state framework of the Second Empire. His incredible imperious will helped him to unite the country, build a strong state core, and catch all the threads of control. Industrialization led peasantry and intelligentsia to a violent breakup of psychology, spreading such a psychological scheme among the people in which everything is considered as a measure of practical utility, where everybody feels as a cog in the giant machine and considers it as standard. It is the scheme in which the art is degenerated, literature becomes a public prostitute, religion dies, cultural heritage is vulgarized, and ethics is emasculated. A quasi-church was constructed that accepted from its predecessor both its original dogmatic steadfastness and its peculiar combination of centralism with democracy, its system of severe internal subordination, as well as its claims to be the sole indicator of the truth. The ideological and structural unity of the party was guarded by the same ruthless measures, entering into a brutal fight with any heresy. Gradually, the quasi-church developed its quasi-worship. Instead of the primitive anti-religious masquerades, the emphasis was given to the arrangement of great mass marches, parades and pompous events during the revolutionary holidays, to the choral performance of the party quasi-psalms and quasi-akathistus, as well as worship of quasi-hallows resting in the quasi-cathedral near the Kremlin walls. The biggest loss of the new era, in comparison with the era of the Second Viceroy, was the absolute imprisonment of the people's collective soul in the unassailable fortress in Direcor. Development of the Russian metaculture slowed down. Items of surrogate art could not reach the Zatomists of the Russian metaculture due to their aesthetic and content-related inferiority. The second leader was especially good at supplying gavak, food for demons. His bloodlust was clearly superior to the extent of necessity permitted during the construction of the statehood building. No other logic could explain the mechanism of the periodic mass bloodlettings established by him. For the first time, he allowed it at the beginning of collectivization, when, according to his plan, the kulaks, to be exact, prosperous peasants, were liquidated as a class. Crowds of people were deprived of their livelihood and, in conditions disastrous even for cattle, were forcibly moved into uninhabited areas where they gave up their spirits to God. In 1933, in Ukraine and some other places, an unprecedented famine occurred. It even came to cannibalism. Woeful cries of the sacrificed, suffering people did not strike a chord in the soul of the oppressor. However, for some time the demiurge did not lift his sanction from the Viceroy, who had acquired a taste for such acts, as he already knew about the upcoming terrible trials, requiring the power of the demon of great powerness. In the late 30s, the lower layers of Shadhanakar repeatedly began to hear a growing roar of infra-physical monsters. They were ready for a mortal combat with each other, hoping to get oceans of Gavak and an eternal dominion over all the Shrastras and the entire Enroth. The years flew like minutes, bringing humankind to the fateful threshold of another major war.
Существует особое
There's
состояние
special states,
хоха.
haka.
Оно обозначает
It means a satanic admiration, or a particular type of ecstatic state,
когда человек
when a person comes into contact with the powerful hierarchs of the demonic world, being not in dreams, not in trance, but fully conscious. As soon as in the 16th century in Spain, the state Hoka was available to the creature. In the 30s and 40s, Stalin so much controlled the condition of Kohar that often he could evoke it at his own wish. This usually occurred at the end of the night. His tremendously wide open black eyes looked at the space with an unblinking gaze. The wrinkles seemed to disappear, his face unrecognizably rejuvenated. So he gathered momentum to strengthen his influence on his environment and people.
Epocha Stalina представлялась мне пиком
The era of
истории.
Stalin seemed to me the peak stage of the third demon's development of the Russian statehood. In the logic of Andreev, it was obvious that it was a cold, rational human tool, specially prepared during many centuries in the depths of dark worlds in order to be introduced into one of the numerous peoples of Europe to become kind of a master of mass murders, expert in the Gavac supply. After all, Andreev thought that in his previous incarnation, the one who is known here as Stalin had been one of the leaders of the medieval Spanish Inquisition, Torquemada's assistant. At that time, he became addicted to human blood, acquired a taste for killing people. Poor Russian people. It had practically no protection against the arbitrariness of demons, as their powerful demiurge constantly had to make concessions with them. Religion that should, in theory, have protected people from that horror in a way, seemed to me then a miserable chimera, a toy in the hands of demons themselves, and Andreev also saw it there, in the otherworldly spaces. The power of his genius, his magnificent mind, has been blowing my mind again and again.
A monad appeared from nowhere in the German Enroth and suddenly became a chosen instrument of the Third Viceroy of Germany. The oppressor considered himself to be German with his own flesh and blood. He loved his land and his people with a strange love in which almost zoological demonic sexualism was combined with the dream of the world domination bliss that he would give to his people. It would be enough for him to bring the people to the bliss and then move into some otherworldly heights and enjoy drinking the incense of grateful generations. His genius capacity for cruelty was not less than Stalin's. He had the same thirst for self-assertion, bloodlust, and was capable of any misdeed. When the war that had roughly destroyed all his calculations did not become a tempting blitzkrieg, but an unprecedented mayhem grinding the flesh of his people for 6 years, he gnashed his teeth, vehemently fell on the floor and bit the carpet with rage, vexation and grief, mourning for his lost compatriots. And even in such circumstances, he still forced them for slaughter until the last moment of his existence. But it was not his icy callousness that had thrown millions of Russians into a slaughterhouse, but a desperate attempt to hold on somehow to the moment when fortune would turn to him and the atomic bomb, finally invented by the Germans, would turn Moscow and London into a lump of dusty garbage.
By the end of the war, the third Viceroy of Russia, as well as his human tools, was full of an unprecedented force. He rushed into the German Schwastra, killed the third Viceroy of Germany, and severely revenged the death of his parent in October 1917. He prepared a genuine massacre and strengthened to such an extent that he subjugated half of Europe. He was full of the thirst for expansion and was limited only by the Viceroys of England and America, Ustra and Stebbing. However, as it had already been in history, the Demiurge soon lifted his sanction from the human tool of the third Viceroy. This was due to the total slipping under the control of the demon of great powerness. The Viceroy and his human tool's deprivation of the Demiurge's support was caused by another sinister bloodletting occurring immediately after the war. Once again, tens of thousands of people, including many war veterans who honestly fulfilled their duty to the fatherland, were sent to distant camps and died there. The decision of the Demiurge and the Synclet of Russia was also influenced by Stalin's ambitious plans to continue his expansion. But during his onslaught on the West, the dictator himself was forced to stop it by one unexpected event. In May 1945, when he had already begun to develop plans to attack former allies, the leader was informed, not by the mystical, but by a quite earthly source, of the testing of the first atomic bomb in New Mexico.
He felt like a nuclear bomb exploded in his mind. Instead of the long-awaited turning of the Second World War against fascism into a crushing of the entire capitalist world, instead of the triumphal march of revolutionary armies across France, Spain, Africa, heading nowhere, he had to freeze in place, biting his elbows and calculating how many years it would take now to acquire nuclear weapons. His mind was tired of the constant overexertion associated with his simultaneous presence in two worlds. He seemed to break down. Sometimes his consciousness failed. The terrible opponent emerging somewhere in Enroth appeared in front of him, who was even more dangerous than Hitler. It seemed to him that this candidate for the Lord of the World should surely have come out of the bowels of the world Jewry. Stalin was aware of the fact that the Jews really had some narrow mystical circles, obsessed with the idea to support the world ruler. The case of saboteur doctors was the first element in a large-scale campaign created by him. However, these plans were not destined to come true. In early March 1953, there was a final battle between the Demiurge Yarosvet and the third Viceroy of Russia. The involtation channel that connected the Viceroy with his human tool was immediately cut. The second leader died. The echoing spaces of the descending world shuddered, resounding with cries of horror and anger. The third Viceroy howled with rage and pain. Hordes of demons flew up from the depths to the upper layers of infracosmos, trying to slow down the heavy fall of the dead monad into the very depths of retribution worlds. The sad madness arrived in Enroth. The funeral of the leader, or rather, the transfer of his body into a mausoleum, turned into an idiotic pandemonium. You know, Professor, I decided to expand the topic. To expand? How? What will happen if we apply the system of Andreev to the current situation, the world situation? Great idea. You know, it's just the theme of the article which I'm finishing now. But I think that it does not mean that we'll write the same things, because we see this situation in different ways.
Could you tell me how you see it, in short?
Well, if only very briefly, in summary. The main provisions of the article are the following. The world has reached a very dangerous stage. The demiurges of different peoples have less control of the statehood demons, the Uicraores. You see, in the 20th century, the demonic Shastras have expanded so much. Millions of people died in suffering. A lot of blood was shed, you know? The demons ate too much gavak. You know what gavak is? Yes, this is the food of the Uicraores. It's a term made by Andreev. Yes, but it's important that the term is started to be included in the simple language and used more often. There's never been such a scale in the history of mankind. But now they shall feed their families, their creepy children. So they fiercely provoke people to make bloodshed. The most important thing is that it happens all over the earth, everywhere, and particularly where the soil is fertilized, where there is fanaticism, religious, national, it does not matter. And in this case, there are huge, illiterate masses, even aggressive masses. Oh yeah, I literally saw it like that. Middle East. Everything suddenly exploded there. And a few years, and how many governments collapsed? People who came to power after the death of the second leader were creatures of a dual and even triple nature. They all succeeded in life while he was alive, and thanks to him, they were all brought up in his political school. They trembled for their existence in front of him, even though deep in their mind, they resented a lot of his actions. As a result of this, the head of both the state and the party was an agile, cunning, cheerful, kind and active sanguine person who firmly resolved to correct the oppressor's mistakes and who was capable of some brave reversals of the party line. However, he did not have enough independence and freshness of mind that could make it possible for him to revise the fundamental errors of the doctrine and the implementation of its old programs. The third leader was neither bloodthirsty nor militant. His soft character left in his being some gaps through which inspirations of forces of light could flow into his subconscious realm. By comparing the new regime to the previous one, everybody felt warmer in the heart. The third leader was a simple man who loved life and sincerely wished a good life not only to himself, but to everybody. This period also witnessed surprising changes in the behavior of the third Uicraore. Exhausted after authorizing all the massacres, he seemed to relax. His actions lost his former harsh implacability. For the first time in many decades, a light breath of Navna reached the Russian Enroth. It didn't last long, and it was not intense. But yet, it was immediately caught by the highly gifted human souls who had been hibernating and leading an aimless life. A wave of inspired art started to rise, and then the Zatomacies of the Russian metaculture got its first mellow fruit of artwork made by the new generation of creators. This wave had a hard time rising. Hidden currents and adverse winds were all out to extinguish it, but still it rose for a little while, as if preparing the ground for a new wave, more active, vivid, and meaningful. But the third leader remained a man of the system, established by his powerful predecessor, and he was not going to change the basic principles of its existence. The sanguine person found himself at the head of a vast empire created by the second leader. Demiurges and the demons of statehood in a number of European countries were under control of the third Viceroy of Russia. For some time, they had been calm, feeling the iron grip of the winner, but having felt its weakening, they began to move in anticipation of release. The first one who did it was the Viceroy of Hungary, who initiated an armed rebellion through his human tools. His claims to independence were harshly suppressed by the third Viceroy. However, this was only the beginning. A serious unrest began in the infra-physical layers adjacent to Europe. The Viceroys of Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and the Czech Republic left their strongholds, roaring and menacingly looking toward the stronghold of the Russian demon of great powerness. The strength that had allowed them to maintain control over their Shrastras gradually disappeared, melting and resulting in dangerous vibrations of the entire framework of the Second Empire. Obeying the inspiration of the third Viceroy, the active optimist rolled all over the world like a ball, trying to keep the system in balance. He tried to make up for his lack of power of will and strength through his tireless activity. But the tragic disparity between the scale of the third leader personality and the tasks set in front of him became more and more apparent. Meanwhile, another confirmation line became clear, though it had been long hidden with an iridescent veil of the post-victory euphoria. The Viceroy of North America, Stebbing, launched the desired global expansion. The Russian Viceroy got in his way. With a strong cudgel in the form of a nuclear weapon tested by him in Japan, Stebbing had a terrible temptation to get the unprecedented portions of Gavak and simultaneously to seize the vast territories. He began to approach the borders of the Second Empire, dragging a mass of well-equipped human tools with him. Launching complexes of nuclear missiles were deployed in Turkey and Italy. For the second time in the period of his stay in power, the third leader showed himself as a worthy disciple of the founder of the Second Empire. He made a strong move on the checkerboard of the global geopolitics. Soviet nuclear missiles were secretly located in Cuba. And then, two mighty statehood demons, snarling viciously, stood opposite each other. Not only Enroth, but all the layers of Shadanakar were quiet and silent, waiting for the outcome of the fight between the demonic giants. For the first time, the planetary space had approached the threshold of self-destruction. If during the era of Stalin, the great demonic mind could still consider a Third World War as an unparalleled source of Gavak, now the monstrous growth of the power of thermonuclear weapons in both coalitions forced him to consider the issue from a different angle. The physical extirpation of mankind did not promise anything good to the demonic world. It was simply not profitable. The inhabitants of infra-physical layers would be deprived of any feeding and get an empty and extremely polluted planet in a non-equilibrious state. The higher authority of the great hierarchy of light, the world's synclet, was already involved in the prevention of any disaster. However, its direct intervention was not required. The demonic mind itself was able to properly assess the situation. As a result, the third leader in NROF and the President of the United States could show their prudence at such a crucial moment. The dangerous situation was successfully resolved.
I drew the final line under the maturity period of the third Viceroy of Russia. It was obvious to me that his fall began with Khrushchev. The meta-history of Daniel Andreev broke off just right on Khrushchev. Andreev passed away during his reign. I was impressed by the fact that he died literally next day after he finished his last chapter of The Rose of the World. This great man completely fulfilled his mission. He gave the world a complete image of the universe and the method of the current event understanding. At that time, I was excitedly studying the version of the further Russian meta-history stated by the professor. It was evident that he sought to consider everything through Daniel Andreev's method. Yet, it was obvious that the professor invented and analyzed all the events he knew by the means of his intelligence, while Andreev had seen them and their reverse side directly. And still, the professor's version seemed to me quite logical and justified.
However, a mild resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis did not mean that the very knot of international politics completely loosened. The Viceroy of the United States, closely associated with the highly experienced hierarchy of the Jews, continued to greedily sweep over the vast expanses of the Russian NROF, cherishing the dream of their seizure. Young and strong, he managed to cooperate with his distant relatives in Western Europe and lie in a way that his tentacles roamed along most of the borders of the Soviet Union. Considering mistakes of his German predecessor, the Viceroy of North America directed his human tools at developing the global ideological concept that, like Marxism, would carry a grain of universality. It was an idea potentially capable to master billions of minds. It was an idea of the global cosmopolitanism that should form the basis of the future material and sensual consumer society. It was also important that the Judah hierarchy controlled stepping and managed to establish a special layer in Shadhanakar that can be described as an otherworldly correspondence with financial area, as they call it in NROF. With the help of his massive weapon, the US economy, the Judah egregor managed to take control over a large part of the area. It was the power of money that was the main means of implementing global expansion. Ideologists of the doctrine of cosmopolitanism saw a future possibility of the total control over the information space of humanity with the help of new technological devices. Stebbing consistently entangled almost half of NROF with his tentacles of his monopolies and trading firms. However, the economic enslavement of the world was not enough for him. It was only a step on his way to achieve his final goal. The absorption of Shastra of the Russian Viceroys cleared the way for him to subjugate Asia, especially the densely populated areas of China and India. It also revealed a dizzying prospect of the uncontrolled world domination. There are two major, most powerful Viceroys that seem to be about to bring the match to the powder keg in order to explode everything. They are unwinding the worlds of confrontations. What kind of Viceroys? And who are they? The first one is the American. He grew up in the last century and has now become a very powerful and strong one. And who leads him on a short leash? The Viceroy of the Jews, an old and experienced one, cunning, insidious. He holds the American like a mad dog and he gives him bloody pieces. Eat it, and he gobbles. And this sweet couple wants to get the whole world at once. Feeling a new, dangerous enemy, the third Viceroy began to look for a replacement of his simple-minded and militant human tool. The new leader was a man from the party environment with some battlefield experience. He was of medium height, thick-set, strong-willed by nature, but not malicious. The fourth leader had propensity to prudence, was a stranger to hasty decisions. During the early period of his reign, there were changes for the better in the country. Above all, it concerned the industrial area that had stepped into a stage of vigorous development. The people in the village also experienced some relief, for after the voluntarist intrusion of the third leader, there was a rise of agriculture. But the main attention of the system was given to the military equipment, where the majority of the working population was sent, but their living standards were still low. Alas, the new leader also had fatal limitations. His narrow, pragmatic mind was unable to comprehend the current situation with the necessary degree of perspicacity. He simply did not see that the empire established by the second leader moved under its own momentum, that it had exhausted all development resources and essential radical changes were necessary. All of the most significant events that had occurred shortly after his accession to power showed weakness of the second Viceroy and the entire state complex of the Second Empire. The armed rebellion in Czechoslovakia and riots in Poland were the first alarm triggers. The monolith structure of the Eastern Bloc was covered with cracks and its fractures were perfectly ready to fall off. The situation could be aligned only by a strong personality with a broad mind, able to carry out deep reforms. But the system did not allow people of such a kind to rise to the surface. The framework of the state complex of the Second Empire became increasingly flabby and fragile. In anticipation of the upcoming catastrophic changes, Yarosvet forced the third Viceroy to remove the segregated child, the yellow Zhirogrit, from the main strongholds of the Russian Shastra and hide it in a distant stronghold in one of the Ural regions. When the fourth leader finally gave up his spirit, the old demon of the Russian statehood was still alive. While weakening, he tried to establish a new involtation channel for human tools in order to stop the collapse of statehood somehow. But the funnel of his movements towards the abyss immediately involved them, one after the other. Finally, an event occurred significant to the entire world, affecting the whole future of the Second Empire. The third Viceroy of Russia collapsed and died, together with the last General Secretary. Professor, I have some new questions.
Так,
So,
и что это за вопросы?
what kind of questions? Andreev died in 1959. His description of the metahistory ended with Khrushchev. So what's next? I do not understand yet. I've not understood what was going on in that world,
and I do not really get what you were based on while writing your article, when you tried to apply the method of Daniel Andreev to the present world.
What do you think about it?
In fact, you don't have such sources of information as he did, right? So you have only logic.
You're right. On the basis of general logic, according to Andreev, the meta-history of Russia is exactly the story of three demons of statehood. When the demon is young and strong, the empire is powerful as well, but so is the tyranny. But when the Viceroy is becoming weaker, the empire begins to fall apart.
Yes, I got it.
The time of troubles. The first one died. You're right. Lenin and revolution. And the second one died. Correct. So Gorbachev and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The third one died. So, well, what do you think of? What's next? What's next? What do you think? Next. I don't know. I have to think. Really. What was next?
Then the aggressive and predatory Viceroy of the USA, Stebing, came close to the strongholds of the Russian statehood demons. In the power elite of the USSR, he found a human tool that was disoriented and could serve as a mechanism for the system's explosion. It was an active man with the characteristic mark on the head who belonged to a younger generation than the entire Brezhnev Guard. Knowing the life of the Western civilization that was far ahead for many reasons, he liked Peter the Great, cherished the hope of its reunion with the USSR in order to take the best from it. At the same time, he had no intention to ruin the country for the sake of other people. However, the seventh leader was too straightforward and naive. Being more educated and cultured than his predecessors, he was inferior to them in recognition of the seriousness and strength of cunning of the opposing rival. He was extremely open, credulous, and talkative. A detailed design of the USSR's gradual collapse was developed in the structures of the US mental complexes. It was a cunning trap that was intended to catch the new leader, and finally he was caught. However, after initiating his radical reforms, the seventh leader was not quite consistent in the destruction of statehood, succumbing to the influence of his sensible advisors. But in this case, Stebing had prepared another person as a reserve. The gloomy heavyweight was sent towards the marked leader who had been dreaming of great power for a long time. He was used as a powerful battering ram that immediately blew the wavering walls of the Russian statehood. The heavyweight announced the collapse of the Second Empire, disguising the evidence of the fact with flowery formulas. Stebing and his coalition triumphed. They thought that the Russian Viceroy's line was interrupted. They were unaware that there was a yellow Zhrugrit in the relatively deserted lair of the Russian Shastra, who received Shava in small amounts, radiation of the state complex of the weakening state. Stebing's tentacles reached the wealth of the great nation taken under control. The situation was similar to the period of the time of troubles, but it was different in scope and ponderosity, as well as the number of people involved in the vortex of destruction. The shelling of the Parliament building by tanks was the last battle of defenders of the Second Empire's statehood, and the first appearance of the very young Viceroy of Russia on the historical arena. It was a wild implementation of the destructive destiny, idiotic creativity of Russian generals who had almost lost their heads in the pandemonium. Europe was puzzled and looked at the show with amazement, and if people had not been killed there, they would have considered it as a Russian comedy. However, the Fourth Viceroy had absorbed a significant portion of Gavak for the first time. He crawled to the strongholds of the Russian Viceroys, resisting the pressure of Stebing, surrounded by the crowds of small demons who obeyed and recognized his power. The new owner of the strongholds now clearly saw his enemies, with their waves of hatred and their strength and aggressiveness, and the pain of defeat aroused in him a fierce desire for revenge. He crawled back, determined to prepare for a new battle a little bit later. Meanwhile, Stebing had a lot of problems in other regions of the world, especially in the Middle East. His grip on the throat of Russia eased for some time. The young Viceroy began to look for human tools in Enrof that could provide him support in the restoration of statehood. The collapse of the army and production was stopped by the forces in the military and civilian administration that remained loyal to the fatherland. On the eve of the millennium, the Demiurge and Sinclit managed to establish an involtation channel for the old and weak president. Under the influence of his wife and members of his family, he decided to retire, presenting his successor to the people. Well, we have come to the conclusion that the third Viceroy died in 1984, right? Is it correct? And what will be next in your opinion? Well, then there shall be the fourth one, the fourth Viceroy. Correct. And who? Through whom is he working now? Putin? You're right. It's very likely. Exactly. It's very likely that he caught the flows, well, as Andreev says, an involtation from the Demiurge and the fourth Viceroy. He's following their will now. He started to rebuild the area of super-people, to return the lost territories. Most importantly, he's begun to turn down, to get rid of hostile demons. Do you understand? If he's not afraid, well, if he does not give up, unless, of course, he's killed, he will become a significant rodomicil, as Andreev says, and then he will just restore the status of Imperial Russia. But it's bad, this status, for what? My dear student, you do not understand the main thing. In this world where the ball is ruled by the demons today, the balance is broken, the balance is destabilized. One seeks to place others under his command. Well, this is the nature of demons. The lack of competition makes their audacity boundless, limitless. So now the balance is disturbed, and the fourth Viceroy can return, restore the balance. Do you understand? And if Putin will be removed? God forbid, as they say. But in any case, the fourth Viceroy has just started working. He would find a new human tool for himself, and it would be even more powerful than the previous one. Well, it's like Lenin and Stalin. Stalin was also stronger, right? Yes. So in any case, it will not be good for Russia's enemies. Oh la la. We do not have any information about where this human soul comes from, for the messenger of Russia, Daniel Andreev, left Enrof long before his introduction.
But a lot of things spoke for the fact that this role was given to him not by chance, and that the Demiurge and the Viceroy were likely to lead him. The history of the first and second statehood demons showed that only 3 decades after the accession of the Viceroy, his real influence had become noticeable. This time the situation was similar. The strengthening of statehood during the reign of the 9th leader occurred gradually, though, as the Viceroy matured. All qualities were proportionate in his essence, emotions and mind, will and kindness, inclemency and condescension. The 9th leader began to build a new state axis, in the same way as the 2nd leader had done it. He established the ruling party and strengthened the institutions of power. He bent the regions economically and administratively, subordinating them to the centre, to restore the production ties and modernize the army. He did everything that the head of a vast, orderless country with strange contradictions had to do. He gathered it together and created a controlled state, without taking disgruntled screams into account. Inspiration of the 4th Viceroy was directed against him, but this time it did not cause the thirst for bloodshed in the statehood demon's human tool. This time the counter-influence of the Demiurge blocked the dark energy of the demonic world, indicating that the Demiurge had learned from the tragic episodes of the recent history.
I think the Russian Viceroy did not leave the idea of expansion. I think he can move on in Europe and in Asia. No. Now you're wrong. The Russian Viceroy does not have such cudgel in his hands like the American does, because in the past century the Russian Viceroy was cropped twice and failed on his rise. He's lost most of all human tools, the tens of millions. He's weakened. The American, he just broke the bank at the expense of others. Look here, in physical terms, he has military bases, vassal countries, colonies all over the world, control over the information, a huge financial empire. No, the Russian Viceroy, the 4th, cannot go anywhere. To preserve an area and people is the one concern he has. But this he's not allowed to do. Everybody shouts. What an insolence! Everybody shouts. What an insolence! They put a spoke in the wheel, pull down the economy. Even France itself. It's also dancing after Stebbing's pipe. They don't like the Russian bear. They're afraid of it so much. And they're right. Look how it clutched Ukraine. No, he didn't clutch Ukraine at all. Stebbing is the one who wants to devour it, to settle down next to Russia and watch for the moment when the 4th Viceroy will be weakened. Russia is a big chunk, but I believe he can choke. He removed the sticky and tenacious tentacles of Stebbing slowly but consistently. Russia, like most parts of the world, hooked on the green dollar needle by the catchy financiers of rim shorts, could not get rid of the dependence in a day or in an hour. But after a while, the intentions of the intelligence officer to get rid of the dependence became apparent for Stebbing and rim shorts. Then their suspicious attention again turned to Russia. Imagine their surprise and anger when they found the restored strongholds of the Russian Viceroys with a new demon of great powerness in it, especially a young and powerful one who had nearly reached the adult size. Stebbing realized that a direct clash with the new Russian monster could have catastrophic consequences for all of mankind.
Но я уверен в
But
одном.
I'm sure of one thing now.
Сейчас.
Here in the world, a very serious fight is brewing between the most powerful demiurges and the most powerful demons. And if that fight takes place, it is fraught with the death of the whole planet. Do you understand it? And our fourth will rush between those two fires, China and the US. Do you get it? This is how I see the situation for the coming 150 to 200 years. Andreev writes that the Antichrist shall come, that then the Dark Age will start.
Да,
Yes,
он получил.
he got such information. He was made to see that in this eon, that is many millennial cycle, humanity will not be able to get rid of the eyesore. Well, the devil's seeds in every human, understand? All the time, again and again, people will have to go through the crucible of different tests, bloody battles, horrible, terrible challenges. Only after that, then there will be the light. But still, there's hope, right? After all, there's free will. Free will. But that's what we call hope. The only hope. It's a very weak hope. We have to limit the appetites of demons. Otherwise, the end of all of us will be... How? How can we make it? We must teach them to eat other food. Of course, they will not become vegetarians, but not to provoke people on blood or murder. Do you understand? We must limit the influence of secret societies. They are the driving belts of demons. We should derive a new type of rulers, the one who are metaphysically enlightened, advanced. We must counterbalance them. We need to increase the number of smart and light people. Correct. Well done. That's right. So, your generation and the following ones have to do everything for that. Yes, of course. There are some achievements in Europe. Well, I mean, their thinking has emancipated, scientific knowledge. But we need to look to the heart of the matter. We need to refuse the primitivism, you know, the old religions, old philosophical schools. We need new philosophical movements, new philosophical brains, you know. You understand me, right? I do. The Viceroy of North America, Stebbing, began to look for new moves to get closer to the rising Russia. Stebbing turned his attention to the Viceroy of Ukraine, small but aggressive and eager for Gavak, a Russian neighbor with centuries-old ties. Stebbing and coalition decided to begin approaching the possessions of the fourth Viceroy in order to draw him into a series of protracted conflicts and create an instability area around him. He actively helped the Viceroy of Ukraine to destabilize the situation in the country, turning the whipping top of destabilization and violence in its capital, and after a while, destroyed the current government. I was shown that namely the emission of horror, fear and sorrow compensates the decline of vital forces in the demon's camp. And that is why they constantly seek to create such conditions here in Enroth, where the blood is running in torrents and people are dying in agonized suffering. People should understand that always and everywhere, where they observe too much evil, or evil created for the sake of evil, or evil associated with a bullying behavior over other people, it is always a result of the emissions released by covetous, discursive, demonic creatures deprived of the ability to empathize with someone. I'm more and more imbued with respect for the knowledge and intelligence of my scientific consultant. Applying the methods of Daniel Andreev to modernity helped reveal the hidden logic of events and even predict development. The Viceroy of North America, Stebbing, fortified by his initial successes, attempted to exploit his strike by setting the demon of statehood of Ukraine and the fourth Viceroy of Russia on each other. However, Stebbing didn't take into account a very important fact. These two parts of the same supra people still had a common demiurge, same old Yarosvet. When both Viceroys were dangerously close to each other in the eastern Ukraine, when groups of their armed human tools rushed on each other, raising firestorms, the demiurge came between them. After that, the eagerness to fight of the Ukrainian son started to subside. He realized what kind of power he was facing. Meanwhile, the fourth Viceroy, becoming more and more confident in his powers, started to restore the united territory of the Supra people. His first human tool, the ninth leader, managed to take the Crimean Peninsula under his control quickly and without bloodshed. The very same territory conquered by warriors of the Supra people 2 centuries ago with the support of the second Viceroy of Russia. Decisiveness and rigidity of the ninth leader indicated the development of his imperious attitude of mind, which is mainly an achievement of the fourth Viceroy. The contours of the restored Third Russian Empire were already outlined in the rising worlds, unavailable for the Viceroys that can only see their reflection with their limited vision. Now the ninth leader did not have any other way except for the movement towards a complete break from the financial web of stebbing and rim shorts. That's why he started moving to the east, to the rising giants of China and India. If only someone among the people embodied in Enroth was able to penetrate into the infra-physical layers during this period, he would have seen how the fourth Viceroy of Russia, the Viceroy of China, Lei Zhoi, and the ancient demiurge of India see each other through the darkened spaces, cutting off the communication lines between them with their burning needles. It was a really majestic performance, containing the potential of the future changing pattern of the entire world arrangement.
Ты знаешь, Андрей?
You know, Henry,
Кстати, думал о тебе.
I was thinking about you, by the way.
Я увидел
And I foresaw that when you were 45, 47 years old, you will have your own philosophical school.
философская школа.
Really? School?
Да,
Yes, school.
ты обязан
You have to open the whole philosophical movement in Europe, a new one.
у тебя для
And
этого.
you have everything for that.
Ты
You
знаешь,
know,
ты не
you did not
случайно
come
сюда
here
приехал.
by
Не зря
accident.
ты здесь
Not in
оказался.
vain you are here.
Конечно, не зря. Я
Of
познакомился
course,
с
not in
вами.
vain. I met you and you told me about Andreev a lot.
Вы мне рассказали многое.
Польза была
The
обоюдной.
benefits were mutual.
Мерси.
So,
Значит, скоро домой во
soon you will
Францию.
go home to France, right? Okay then. Go.
Езжай.
Say hello to France. I really love your country.
Спасибо.
Thank you. The expiry date of my work visa was close, and I had no intention to renew it. I realized that my mind was saturated, both with information and my own thoughts. I had to go home, to make all things as clear as a bell there. In the last days before I left, I walked around Moscow a lot, and an idea came into my head. The more powerful the demon of Russian statehood is, the more powerful is his man-tool, and the more the people are calm. Around me, I saw a lot of people walking, resting, enjoying nature, looking for new experiences, falling in love. In short, they just lived. You could feel the calmness everywhere. People felt protected. But now, as I knew the hidden logic of Russian history, I could not assess all things happening too rosily, knowing that everything may quickly change. I felt now that I couldn't see and assess the ongoing events as I used to do it. My vision seemed to expand and strengthen, and now I could see what was happening not only on the stage, but also behind the scenes, behind the screen of events. And deep inside, I could feel a desire to see the times when the nation will be guided through history by its radiant leaders, its demiurge and collective soul, and the era of vitriors would become a thing of the past. Probably after that, absolutely different times would come on the earth.